The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maria wiped down the last table at Bella Vista, the flagship restaurant that had been her second home for nearly 15 years. The familiar scent of garlic and basil still lingered in the air despite the late hour, mixing with the antiseptic smell of cleaning supplies. Her back ached from another 14-hour shift, but she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who understood every corner of the business. The dinner rush had been particularly brutal tonight, with 3 servers calling in sick and the new kitchen manager struggling to keep up with ticket times. As she folded the damp cleaning cloth and placed it in the sanitizer bucket, Maria allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Revenue was up 12% from last month, and customer satisfaction scores had reached an all-time high. The online reviews consistently praised the seamless service and attention to detail that she had spent years perfecting. Every system, every protocol, every training manual had her fingerprints on it. The sound of expensive leather shoes clicking against the tile floor broke her reverie. Derek and Brandon strutted through the front entrance like they owned the place, their perfectly pressed suits and smug expressions immediately setting her on edge. Where viewers are watching from tonight probably determines how familiar you are with family business drama, because every family seems to have those relatives who show up only when money is involved. Comment below and let us know what state or country you are watching from. Derek, the older of the 2 cousins at 38, carried a manila envelope with the kind of theatrical importance that suggested its contents would change everything. His Yale MBA had been the crown jewel of his identity for over a decade, something he managed to work into conversations with impressive frequency. Brandon, 2 years younger but equally arrogant, followed half a step behind with his phone already recording. "We are conducting an official family business meeting," Derek announced without preamble, his voice carrying the cold authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. His pale blue eyes swept over the restaurant with the calculating gaze of an appraiser rather than someone who had grown up eating Sunday dinners at these very tables. Maria straightened slowly, confusion flickering across her tired features. The cousins had never shown much interest in the day-to-day operations before, preferring to collect their quarterly distributions without asking questions about how the money was actually earned. Their sudden appearance at closing time felt ominous in a way she could not quite articulate. Brandon stepped forward with barely contained excitement, like a child about to reveal a secret that would devastate his playmate. "After extensive consultation with our legal and financial advisors, we have determined that significant restructuring is required to ensure the continued profitability and professional management of our restaurant holdings." The formal language sounded rehearsed, as if they had practiced this speech multiple times in front of a mirror. Derek opened the envelope with exaggerated ceremony and withdrew a stack of official-looking documents. The letterhead belonged to Morrison, Klein & Associates, a law firm that specialized in corporate restructuring and had a reputation for aggressive tactics. "These are your termination papers, effective immediately," Derek stated with the satisfaction of a judge delivering a verdict. "Your employment with the restaurant group is hereby terminated for cause, specifically gross incompetence in management duties and failure to maintain professional standards consistent with our corporate vision." The words hit Maria like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain standing despite the way her knees suddenly felt unsteady. She had poured her heart and soul into these restaurants, working 16-hour days during the pandemic to keep them afloat when other establishments were closing permanently. Every successful menu launch, every positive review, every loyal customer relationship had been built through her dedication and expertise. Brandon pulled out his phone and began reading from what was clearly a prepared statement. Furthermore, as part of the corporate restructuring initiative, all management-level positions will be filled by qualified professionals with appropriate educational credentials and proven track records in restaurant management. The era of amateur hour operations ends today. Derek nodded approvingly at his younger cousin before turning his attention back to Maria. "Your last day of employment was yesterday, though we are being generous enough to allow you until Friday to collect your personal belongings. You have 48 hours to vacate the apartment above the restaurant, as staff housing is being eliminated to reduce overhead costs." The apartment had been her home for over a decade, a cozy space where she had celebrated promotions and nursed herself through illnesses. where she had planned menus and balanced books long into the night. The idea of being forced out with less than 2 days' notice felt like a violation of something sacred. But Derek was not finished with his demolition. We have also discovered significant irregularities in the financial records that will require a comprehensive audit. Your access to all company accounts, vendor relationships, and operational systems will be terminated tonight. Security codes have been changed and new management protocols are already in place. Maria found her voice at last, though it came out smaller and more fragile than she had intended. I have worked here for 15 years. I know every aspect of these restaurants better than anyone. The customers trust me, the staff respects me, and the numbers speak for themselves. Revenue is up, costs are down, and we have the highest customer satisfaction ratings in the district. Brandon laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the empty walls. Playing restaurant manager does not qualify as real work experience, Maria. Derek and I both have MBAs from top-tier business schools. We understand corporate strategy, financial optimization, and operational efficiency in ways that, frankly, someone with your limited educational background simply cannot comprehend. Derek stepped closer, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Look around you, Maria. This is not some neighborhood diner where good intentions and hard work are sufficient. We are running a multi-location restaurant enterprise that requires sophisticated business acumen and strategic thinking. The fact that you have managed to avoid completely bankrupting us is admirable, but we need actual professionals in charge now. The cousins exchanged a look of shared superiority, the kind of silent communication that comes from years of looking down on others together. Their confidence was absolute, their conviction unshakable. They had clearly spent considerable time convincing themselves that this hostile takeover was not only justified, but long overdue. We have already begun the process of recruiting experienced restaurant executives to oversee operations, Brandon continued, consulting his phone as if reading from talking points. The new management team will implement proper systems and procedures that align with industry best practices and maximize shareholder value. Maria felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, but refused to let them fall in front of the cousins. She could already imagine how they would interpret any show of emotion as further evidence of her unsuitability for business leadership. Instead, she wrapped her arms around herself and tried to process the magnitude of what was happening. Your personal effects should fit in a few boxes, Derek said dismissively. We are not unreasonable people, so you can take whatever kitchen utensils or photographs belong to you personally. However, any recipes, vendor contracts, customer lists, or operational documentation belongs to the company and must remain on the premises. The casual cruelty of reducing her life's work to a few boxes of personal trinkets was breathtaking in its callousness. Every recipe had been tested dozens of times. Every vendor relationship had been cultivated through years of mutual respect and fair dealing. Every operational procedure had been refined through trial and error and deep understanding of what actually worked in practice. Brandon was already walking toward the kitchen, his voice carrying back with bureaucratic efficiency. We have scheduled a family meeting for tomorrow evening to discuss the transition plan and introduce the new management structure. Your attendance is neither required nor particularly welcome, given that this is now a matter for actual stakeholders to address. Derek remained behind for a moment longer, studying Maria with the clinical detachment of someone examining a laboratory specimen. You should understand that this decision is final and non-negotiable. Any attempts to interfere with the transition or contact employees inappropriately will result in legal action for interference with business operations. As the cousins finally departed, their expensive shoes clicking against the floor with the same arrogant rhythm that had announced their arrival, Maria sank into the nearest chair and tried to comprehend the devastation that had just been unleashed upon her life. The restaurant felt different already, as if their presence had somehow contaminated the warm familiarity she had always found within these walls. Yet beneath the shock and hurt, something else flickered in her dark eyes. Something that suggested this story was far from over, and that Derek and Brandon had made assumptions that would prove to be their undoing. Something that hinted at depths of knowledge and preparation that the cousins, in their infinite arrogance, had never thought to investigate. The next morning arrived with the kind of cold precision that suggested the cousins had been planning their campaign for months. Derek began his systematic demolition of Maria's reputation with a series of phone calls to the other 7 restaurant locations, each conversation carefully crafted to paint a picture of incompetence and financial irresponsibility that would justify their hostile takeover. From his corner office at the corporate headquarters he had claimed for himself, Derek dialed the manager at Rose's Garden, the second most profitable location in their portfolio. His voice carried the grave authority of someone delivering unfortunate but necessary news. "I want you to understand that this decision was not made lightly," he explained to Elena, the day shift supervisor who had worked closely with Maria for 8 years. "After conducting a comprehensive review of the financial records and operational procedures, we discovered irregularities that simply cannot be ignored any longer. Maria's management style, while well-intentioned, has been holding back our potential for growth and profitability." Elena's confused protests were cut short with the kind of corporate speak that Derek had mastered during his consulting days. "I understand your loyalty to her, but loyalty cannot supersede fiduciary responsibility to our stakeholders. The numbers do not lie, Elena. We have been operating significantly below industry standards for customer turnover, profit margins, and operational efficiency." Brandon, meanwhile, had taken charge of the digital warfare aspect of their campaign. From his laptop at a trendy coffee shop downtown, he systematically changed passwords for every system Maria had access to, from the point-of-sale software to the employee scheduling platform. Each keystroke felt like a small victory in their war to reclaim what they considered rightfully theirs. He sent carefully worded emails to all staff members across the restaurant chain, explaining that new security protocols were being implemented as part of a comprehensive modernization initiative. The subtext was clear without being legally actionable. Maria's access was being revoked because she could no longer be trusted with sensitive business information. The vendors who had worked with Maria for years began receiving similar communications. Derek positioned himself as the new primary contact for all business relationships, explaining that the previous management structure had been too informal and lacked proper oversight. He spoke of implementing robust vendor management systems and professional procurement processes that would ensure better value for their restaurant group. Tony Benedetto, who had been supplying fresh produce to the restaurants for over a decade, called Maria directly after receiving Derek's email. His voice was thick with confusion and concern as he tried to understand what was happening to the woman who had always treated his family business with respect and fairness. "Maria, what is going on over there?" Tony asked. "This Derek fellow is telling me that all our agreements need to be renegotiated because they were never properly documented. He is questioning every price point and demanding compliance certifications that we have never needed before." Maria felt her heart sink as she realized the scope of the cousin's destruction extended far beyond her personal situation. These vendor relationships represented years of careful cultivation, built on mutual trust and shared commitment to quality. Derek and Brandon were treating them like interchangeable commodities in a spreadsheet rather than the human partnerships that actually made the restaurant successful. Meanwhile, Derek was orchestrating what he called an emergency family meeting at the flagship restaurant. He had invited every relative with even a peripheral connection to the business, from elderly aunts who received small quarterly distributions to young cousins who occasionally worked summer shifts during college. The meeting was scheduled for 6 o'clock on Thursday evening, deliberately timed to occur during the dinner rush so that the impact of their announcement would be witnessed by staff and customers alike. Derek had even arranged for a local business reporter to attend, spinning the story as an inspiring tale of young entrepreneurs taking over a family legacy to drive innovation and growth. As family members gathered around the hastily arranged tables, Derek stood at the front of the restaurant with the confidence of someone delivering a keynote address. His PowerPoint presentation was projected onto a hastily installed screen, complete with charts and graphs that painted a damning picture of declining performance under Maria's leadership. "Ladies and gentlemen," Derek began with theatrical gravity, "we are here tonight because our family's restaurant legacy has reached a critical juncture. The comfortable complacency of the past 15 years has resulted in stagnation that threatens not only our current profitability, but our long-term viability as a competitive enterprise. Brandon distributed printed packets that contained what they claimed were financial analyses proving Maria's mismanagement. The documents looked impressively official, complete with bar charts showing declining profit margins and customer satisfaction scores. The fact that most of the data had been selectively edited or taken out of context was not immediately apparent to family members who rarely examined the actual business operations. Aunt Rosalia, who was 87 years old and remembered when the first restaurant opened, raised a trembling hand with obvious confusion. But Maria has always been such a dedicated girl. The customers love her, and the restaurants seem busy whenever I visit. Are you certain there are problems that require such drastic action? Derek's response was patient but condescending, the tone of someone explaining complex concepts to someone who simply lacked the sophistication to understand modern business realities. Aunt Rosalia, I appreciate your emotional attachment to Maria. She is family, and we all care about her well-being. However, caring about someone does not mean enabling their professional limitations when doing so jeopardizes everyone's financial security. Brandon stepped forward with additional documentation that supposedly proved their point. According to our analysis, we are operating at 63% of industry standard efficiency. Our food costs are 18% higher than comparable establishments, and our employee turnover rate suggests significant management deficiencies. These are not opinions. They are quantifiable facts that require immediate corrective action. When Maria finally arrived at the restaurant, summoned by a panicked text from one of the servers, she walked into what felt like a public trial. Every eye in the room turned toward her with expressions ranging from confusion to pity to barely concealed hostility. The cousins had clearly been effective in their character assassination campaign. Derek gestured toward her with the magnanimous air of someone offering an opportunity to defend herself, though his expression suggested he expected nothing but pathetic excuses. Maria, since you are here, perhaps you would like to address the family about your management philosophy and explain how you plan to improve performance metrics going forward. The question was designed to humiliate rather than elicit meaningful dialogue, but Maria stepped forward with a composure that surprised everyone present. Her voice was steady and clear as she began to speak, showing no trace of the devastated woman from the night before. I have dedicated 15 years of my life to making these restaurants successful, she said simply. Every decision I have made has been guided by a commitment to quality, consistency, and treating our customers and employees with respect. The financial performance speaks for itself, with revenue growth in each of the last 8 consecutive quarters. Brandon interrupted with a dismissive laugh. Revenue growth means nothing if profit margins are shrinking due to operational inefficiency. You may have good intentions, Maria, but intention is not a substitute for education and professional training. Derek and I both hold advanced degrees from prestigious institutions specifically because we understand that modern business requires sophisticated analytical skills. Derek nodded approvingly at his cousin's intervention before delivering what he clearly considered the knockout blow. The reality is that managing restaurants in today's competitive environment requires expertise in financial modeling, operational optimization, supply chain management, and strategic planning. These are not skills that can be learned through trial and error or developed through good intentions and hard work. The family members shifted uncomfortably as the cousins continued their systematic demolition of Maria's credibility. Uncle Frank, who had always been particularly fond of Maria, looked increasingly troubled by the aggressive tone of the proceedings, but seemed unsure how to intervene in what was clearly a carefully orchestrated presentation. As the evening progressed, Derek and Brandon produced bottle after bottle of expensive champagne, toasting their vision for the future while simultaneously celebrating what they described as their rescue of the family business from years of stagnation. Their confidence was absolute, their conviction unshakable, and their cruelty breathtaking in its calculated efficiency. Yet observers might have noticed something unexpected in Maria's demeanor throughout the ordeal. Despite the public humiliation and systematic destruction of her reputation, she maintained a calm dignity that suggested reserves of strength the cousins had never suspected. Her responses were measured rather than emotional, her posture straight rather than defeated, and her eyes held something that looked almost like patience rather than devastation. When the meeting finally ended and family members dispersed with confused murmurs and uncertain glances, Maria remained behind to help clean up the restaurant, as she had done countless times before. Derek and Brandon, meanwhile, retired to the bar area to continue their celebration, convinced that their triumph was complete and their authority now unquestionable. What they failed to notice was the way Maria methodically collected certain documents that had been left behind, or how she made quiet phone calls from the kitchen while they were distracted by their victory party. They were so intoxicated by their own success that they missed the subtle signs suggesting their opponent was far more formidable than they had ever imagined. Friday morning arrived with the kind of legal complications that Derek and Brandon had never anticipated. Their attorney, James Morrison from Morrison, Klein & Associates, called Derek's cell phone at 7:30 with a tone that suggested their victory celebration had been premature. "Derek, we have encountered some unexpected obstacles in finalizing the property transfers," Morrison said without his usual confident bluster. "The title company is requesting additional documentation that, frankly, I am not sure we possess. There appear to be some historical ownership agreements that predate your involvement with the restaurant operations." Derek sat up straighter in his expensive leather chair, irritation flashing across his features. "What kind of historical agreements? We have been involved in these restaurants for over 5 years. Surely any relevant documentation would have been disclosed during our initial partnership discussions with the family." Morrison's hesitation was audible through the phone connection. "That is what we assumed as well, but the title search has revealed some complexities in the ownership structure that were not apparent from the operational agreements you provided. We need to locate the original property deeds and any amendments that may have been filed over the years." Brandon, who had been eavesdropping on the conversation, grabbed the phone with characteristic impatience. "This is ridiculous, James. How complicated can restaurant ownership possibly be? We are talking about 8 properties that have been in the family for decades. Just file whatever paperwork is necessary to complete the transfers." The attorney's response carried a note of professional caution that neither cousin wanted to hear. "Unfortunately, Brandon, property law is not quite that simple. We cannot transfer ownership of assets without clear documentation of current legal title. The title company has identified several properties where the ownership chain appears to have gaps or irregularities that must be resolved before we can proceed." Across town, Maria walked into the marble lobby of Caldwell, Barnes & Associates with the measured steps of someone who belonged in such surroundings. The law firm occupied the top 3 floors of the city's most prestigious office building, and their client roster included Fortune 500 companies and high-net-worth individuals who demanded both discretion and results. Rebecca Caldwell, the senior partner who specialized in complex property transactions and family business disputes, greeted Maria with the kind of professional warmth reserved for valued clients. Their relationship clearly extended beyond a simple attorney-client consultation, suggesting a history of successful collaboration that neither Derek nor Brandon suspected. "I received your call about the situation with your cousins," Rebecca said as she ushered Maria into her spacious corner office. "Based on what you described, it sounds like they have made some significant assumptions about their legal position that may prove to be problematic for them." Maria settled into the plush chair across from Rebecca's desk with the composure of someone accustomed to high-stakes business discussions. Her entire demeanor had shifted from the previous evening's apparent vulnerability to something approaching executive authority. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable to anyone paying close attention. They seemed convinced that their operational involvement over the past 5 years has somehow granted them ownership rights, Maria explained calmly. "Derek and Brandon have been telling everyone that they are implementing a corporate restructuring, but they have never actually examined the underlying property documents." Rebecca nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose expertise was about to prove invaluable. "That is unfortunately common in family business situations. People assume that management responsibility translates to ownership rights, but property law is quite specific about the documentation required to establish legal title." Meanwhile, Derek was discovering that his attempt to access the corporate banking accounts was yielding unexpected resistance. The branch manager at First National Bank, where the restaurant group had maintained their primary operating accounts for over a decade, was requesting documentation that Derek could not provide. "I understand your frustration, Mr. Rossetti," the bank manager explained patiently, but our records show that account access requires authorization from the documented property owners. The signature cards we have on file do not match the individuals you are claiming have management authority. Derek felt the first flutter of genuine concern as he realized that his assumptions about the business structure might have been incomplete. He had always assumed that the quarterly distributions he and Brandon received were evidence of their ownership stake, but the banking complications suggested a more complex legal arrangement. Brandon arrived at the bank 30 minutes later, armed with copies of the termination letter they had served to Maria and the corporate restructuring documents their attorney had prepared. His confidence remained intact, but there was an edge of irritation in his voice that suggested their smooth takeover was not proceeding as planned. "This is obviously some kind of bureaucratic confusion," Brandon declared to the bank manager. "We have been involved in the management of these restaurants for years. Maria was simply an employee who was recently terminated for cause. There is no logical reason why her signature would be required for banking transactions." The bank manager consulted his computer screen with the careful attention of someone who understood that banking regulations left little room for assumptions or good intentions. "According to our records, the primary account holders are listed as the legal property owners, and any changes to account access require documentation from those individuals. I would recommend consulting with your attorney to clarify the ownership structure." As Derek and Brandon left the bank with frustrated expressions and empty hands, Rebecca Caldwell was placing a call to the county clerk's office on Maria's behalf. Her request was simple but comprehensive: copies of all property deeds, liens, transfers, and amendments related to the 8 restaurant properties in question. The clerk's response confirmed what Maria already knew, but the cousins had never bothered to investigate. The property records showed a clear chain of ownership that had remained unchanged for over 15 years, despite the operational changes that had occurred during that time period. By afternoon, Morrison was calling Derek with news that made their morning complications seem trivial by comparison. "Derek, we have a significant problem with the property transfers. The title search has revealed that none of the restaurant properties are owned by the entities we assumed. The legal ownership appears to reside with individuals rather than the corporate structure we have been using for operational purposes." Derek felt his stomach drop as the implications began to sink in. "What do you mean the properties are owned by individuals? We have been receiving quarterly distributions for years. We have been making management decisions and signing vendor contracts. How is individual ownership even possible?" Morrison's response carried the careful tone of an attorney who was beginning to realize his clients had made assumptions that could prove legally catastrophic. "It appears that the operational agreements you have been working under are separate from the property ownership structure. The distributions you have been receiving may have been payments for management services rather than ownership dividends." Brandon, who was listening on speakerphone, felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and growing panic. "This is impossible, James. We have invested 5 years of our lives in building these restaurants. We have made strategic decisions, implemented new systems, and positioned ourselves as the leadership team. You cannot tell me that none of that translates to ownership rights." The attorney's silence stretched uncomfortably before he finally responded with the kind of honesty that clients rarely wanted to hear. "Brandon, your operational involvement and strategic contributions are certainly valuable, but they do not automatically create property ownership. We need to locate the actual property owners and determine what agreements, if any, exist regarding your management role and compensation." As the day progressed and more complications emerged, Derek and Brandon found themselves facing the possibility that their understanding of the business structure had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. Their confidence, which had seemed unshakable just 24 hours earlier, was beginning to crack under the weight of legal realities they had never bothered to investigate. Yet even as doubts crept into their previously absolute certainty, they could not bring themselves to consider the possibility that Maria's calm composure during their hostile takeover might have been based on knowledge rather than resignation. The idea that their former employee might possess legal authority that exceeded their own was simply too far outside their worldview to contemplate seriously. What they failed to recognize was that Maria's quiet meetings and methodical document collection were not the desperate actions of someone scrambling to save her job, but rather the measured preparations of someone who had always understood exactly where the real power resided. Monday morning brought the kind of legal proceedings that Derek and Brandon had never expected to face as defendants rather than plaintiffs. The conference room at Morrison, Klein & Associates felt smaller and less impressive than usual as they sat across from Rebecca Caldwell and her associate, with Maria positioned at the table like someone who belonged in such high-stakes negotiations. Rebecca opened her briefcase with the methodical precision of someone who had prepared extensively for this moment. Her first document was a comprehensive timeline that traced every financial transaction, property improvement, and operational decision made across all 8 restaurant locations over the past 15 years. Let us begin with the property improvements made to the Bella Vista location in 2018, Rebecca stated calmly, consulting her meticulously organized notes. According to the construction permits and invoices, the kitchen renovation that increased capacity by 40% was funded entirely through a loan secured by Ms. Torino personally, not through any corporate entity. Derek shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his usual confidence beginning to show hairline cracks. The kitchen renovation had been one of his proudest achievements, something he frequently mentioned when discussing his strategic vision for the restaurant group. The revelation that he had not actually funded the improvement felt like the ground shifting beneath his feet. Brandon attempted to interject with his characteristic dismissiveness, but his voice lacked its usual authoritative edge. That renovation was implemented based on our recommendation and oversight. The funding source is less relevant than the strategic decision-making that drove the expansion of operational capacity. Maria spoke for the first time since the proceedings had begun, her voice carrying a quiet authority that had been completely absent during the cousins' public humiliation campaign. The renovation was my initiative, based on customer traffic analysis that I conducted over 18 months. I secured the financing, managed the construction process, and absorbed the financial risk because I believed in the long-term potential of the location. Rebecca nodded approvingly before producing another set of documents that made Morrison visibly uncomfortable. These are the property deeds for all 8 restaurant locations, obtained from the county clerk's office this morning. Mr. Morrison, I think you will find them quite illuminating regarding your client's assumptions about ownership structure. As Morrison examined the documents, his expression grew increasingly grave. The legal language was unambiguous in ways that left no room for interpretation or wishful thinking. Each property deed clearly identified Maria Cristina Torino as the sole legal owner, with no mention of Derek and Brandon or any corporate entities they might have assumed held title. Morrison cleared his throat with the reluctance of someone about to deliver devastating news to his own clients. It appears that the ownership structure is indeed more complex than we initially understood. These deeds indicate individual ownership rather than the corporate arrangement we had been assuming was in place. Derek felt his face flush with a mixture of anger and growing panic as the implications became clear. This has to be some kind of mistake or filing error. We have been making management decisions, signing contracts, and receiving distributions for 5 years. You cannot maintain legal ownership while allowing others to operate the business as if they were the owners. Rebecca's response was delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining basic legal concepts to individuals who clearly needed the education. Mr. Rossetti, property ownership and management responsibility are entirely separate legal concepts. Ms. Torino has always retained legal title to the properties while permitting you and your cousin to participate in operational management under specific compensation arrangements. She produced another folder containing what appeared to be years of financial records, each document bearing Maria's signature and containing levels of detail that suggested comprehensive business education and sophisticated financial analysis. The profit and loss statements, cash flow projections, and operational budgets painted a picture of someone with advanced accounting skills and strategic business acumen. Brandon stared at the documents with dawning comprehension that his entire understanding of the situation had been catastrophically wrong. These financial reports were far more sophisticated than anything he had produced during his MBA program, displaying a level of expertise that contradicted everything he had assumed about Maria's qualifications and capabilities. Rebecca continued her methodical presentation without pause or mercy. Ms. Torino holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration from Northwestern University, graduating summa cum laude, followed by a Master of Business Administration with concentrations in finance and operations management. She is also a certified public accountant with over 15 years of experience in restaurant industry financial management. The revelation hit Derek and Brandon like a physical blow, destroying their fundamental assumptions about educational credentials and professional qualifications. Their entire justification for the hostile takeover had been based on their supposed superior education and business expertise compared to someone they had dismissed as an unqualified employee. Morrison was studying additional documents that Rebecca had provided, his expression growing more troubled with each page. "These liens and encumbrances on the properties," he said slowly. "Many of them appear to be related to business expansion and equipment financing that occurred without our knowledge or involvement." Maria responded with the calm confidence of someone discussing details she understood completely. "The liens represent strategic financing decisions I made to fund equipment upgrades, technology improvements, and market expansion initiatives. Each decision was based on careful analysis of return on investment and long-term competitive positioning." Rebecca produced copies of business licenses and regulatory approvals that bore Maria's signature as the responsible party for all legal compliance matters. The documentation showed that Maria had been the primary interface with health departments, licensing authorities, and regulatory agencies for years, taking personal responsibility for ensuring all locations met or exceeded required standards. Family members who had attended the previous week's humiliation meeting began receiving phone calls that afternoon, as word of the legal proceedings spread through the extended family network. Uncle Frank called Derek directly, his voice heavy with confusion and disappointment. "Derek, I am hearing some very disturbing information about what happened at that meeting last week. People are saying that maybe we did not have the full story about Maria's role in the business. If she actually owns the properties, then what exactly have you and Brandon been doing all these years?" Derek struggled to formulate a response that would preserve some shred of the narrative he had constructed about their business leadership role. "Uncle Frank, the ownership structure is complicated, but that does not change the fact that Brandon and I have provided strategic direction and professional management expertise that has been essential to the success of the restaurants." Uncle Frank's response carried the skeptical tone of someone whose faith in their version of events had been seriously shaken. "Strategic direction is one thing, Derek, but if Maria owns the buildings and has been making the financial decisions, then maybe we owe her an apology rather than celebrating her termination." By evening, Morrison was advising Derek and Brandon with the careful language of an attorney who recognized that his client's position had become legally untenable. "Gentlemen, I strongly recommend that we approach this situation with considerably more caution than we initially anticipated. The documentation suggests that your authority to make personnel and operational decisions may have been more limited than you believed." Derek felt his world shifting in ways that challenged everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and business ownership. The comfortable certainty that had sustained his confidence for years was crumbling under the weight of legal realities he had never bothered to investigate. Brandon sat in stunned silence, processing the possibility that their 5 years of management involvement had been based on Maria's permission rather than their own inherent rights. The idea that they had been employees rather than owners was so fundamentally contrary to their self-image that accepting it required a complete reconstruction of their professional identities. What neither cousin could bring themselves to acknowledge was that Maria's composed responses and detailed documentation suggested a level of preparation and business sophistication that made their own credentials seem superficial by comparison. The woman they had dismissed as an unqualified employee was revealing herself to be someone whose expertise and authority had always exceeded their own. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of devastating revelation that would forever alter Derek and Brandon's understanding of their place in the family business hierarchy. Rebecca Caldwell had requested a formal meeting at her office, and the gravity in her voice when scheduling the appointment suggested that the previous day's discoveries had been merely the opening act of a much more comprehensive demolition. The conference room felt different this time, charged with the tension of imminent truth-telling that would leave no room for denial or rationalization. Rebecca entered carrying a leather portfolio that seemed to contain the weight of 15 years of carefully documented reality, while Maria followed with the quiet confidence of someone whose moment of vindication had finally arrived. "Gentlemen," Rebecca began without preamble, "we need to address some fundamental misconceptions about the ownership structure of the restaurant properties that have apparently persisted for several years. The documentation I am about to present will clarify the legal realities in ways that may prove uncomfortable for your previous assumptions." She withdrew a thick document bound in official covers and placed it ceremoniously in the center of the conference table. "This is the master property deed for all 8 restaurant locations, recorded with the county clerk in 2009 and updated most recently in 2021. I think you will find the ownership designation quite illuminating." Derek reached for the document with trembling hands, his usual arrogance replaced by something approaching dread. As he read the legal description, his face went through a series of expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief to dawning horror. The language was unambiguous in ways that left no room for interpretation or wishful thinking. Brandon leaned over his cousin's shoulder to read the document, his own confidence evaporating as the reality of their situation became undeniably clear. According to the deed, Maria Cristina Torino was listed as the sole legal owner of all 8 properties, with no mention of corporate entities, partnership agreements, or shared ownership arrangements of any kind. Morrison studied the document with the careful attention of someone whose professional reputation was suddenly at stake. "The deed appears to be properly executed and recorded," he admitted reluctantly. "However, I am still unclear about how this ownership structure relates to the operational agreements that my clients have been working under for the past 5 years." Rebecca's response carried the satisfaction of someone whose preparation had been thorough and whose position was unassailable. The operational agreements were simply employment contracts that permitted Mr. Rossetti and Mr. Torino to manage day-to-day restaurant operations under Ms. Torino's overall authority. At no point did these agreements convey any ownership interest in the underlying real property. She produced another set of documents that traced the ownership history back to its origins, revealing a story that none of the cousins had ever bothered to investigate. The properties were originally purchased by Ms. Torino's grandmother, Lucia Benedetti, beginning in 1987. Upon Mrs. Benedetti's death in 2009, the entire restaurant portfolio was bequeathed directly to Maria as the sole heir designated in a legally executed will. Derek felt the room spinning as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. The family business that he and Brandon had assumed they were inheriting or earning their way into had never actually belonged to their branch of the family tree. Their years of management involvement had been based on Maria's generosity rather than their own inherent rights. Brandon's voice cracked as he attempted to challenge what seemed impossible to dispute. "But we have been receiving quarterly distributions for 5 years. We have been making strategic decisions and signing contracts with vendors. How could we have been doing all of that without any legal authority or ownership stake?" Maria spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone whose patience with deception had finally reached its limit. "The quarterly payments were management fees for your operational services, calculated as a percentage of net profits from the locations you supervised. I allowed you to sign vendor contracts and make operational decisions because I believed your involvement would benefit the overall business performance." Rebecca nodded approvingly before producing property valuation documents that revealed the true scope of what Derek and Brandon had been attempting to steal through their hostile takeover. According to independent appraisals conducted within the past 6 months, the combined value of all 8 restaurant properties exceeded $15 million, not including the business goodwill and operational assets. The revelation of the property values hit Derek and Brandon like a physical blow, as they realized the magnitude of the empire they had been trying to seize through intimidation and legal maneuvering. Their assumption that they were dealing with a struggling family business had been catastrophically wrong from the beginning. Morrison was studying additional documentation with growing alarm as he recognized the legal exposure his clients had created through their actions. "These termination letters and eviction notices," he said slowly, "they appear to have been served by individuals without any legal authority to make such decisions. Ms. Torino, as the property owner, would have been the only person authorized to terminate tenancies or employment relationships. Rebecca's confirmation carried the weight of legal certainty that would reshape everyone's understanding of recent events. That is correct. The termination letter and eviction notice served to Ms. Torino last week were legally meaningless, as the individuals who served them had no authority to make such decisions. In fact, their attempt to evict the legal property owner could potentially constitute harassment or unlawful interference with property rights. Derek felt his face burning with humiliation as he began to comprehend the full scope of their miscalculation. Everything they had done over the past week, from the public humiliation meeting to the systematic destruction of Maria's vendor relationships, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of who actually held power in their family business structure. Brandon sat in stunned silence as Rebecca continued her methodical destruction of their previous worldview. She produced copies of Maria's educational credentials, including her Northwestern University MBA diploma with concentrations in finance and operations management, her CPA certification from Illinois, and continuing education certificates that demonstrated ongoing professional development in restaurant industry best practices. The documentation revealed that Maria's qualifications far exceeded anything Derek and Brandon had achieved despite their years of boasting about their superior education. Her academic record showed consistent excellence and specialized expertise that was directly relevant to restaurant management, while their general business degrees suddenly seemed generic and less impressive by comparison. Rebecca then presented financial records that demonstrated Maria's personal investment in the restaurant improvements over the years. Every major renovation, equipment upgrade, and expansion project had been funded through her personal credit and secured by her property ownership. The cousins had taken credit for strategic initiatives that Maria had conceived, financed, and implemented. The vendor contracts that Derek had dismissed as informal arrangements were revealed to be sophisticated agreements that Maria had negotiated personally, leveraging her CPA expertise to secure favorable terms and payment schedules. The relationships she had built with suppliers were based on professional competence and financial credibility rather than the family connections the cousins had assumed were responsible for their business success. Morrison was frantically taking notes as he recognized that his client's legal position had moved beyond difficult into potentially catastrophic territory. The documentation suggests that your management role was essentially that of highly compensated employees rather than business partners or owners. Any decisions made without Ms. Torino's explicit authorization could potentially expose you to liability for exceeding your actual authority. Derek and Brandon exchanged looks of mutual devastation as the full scope of their humiliation became clear. Their public celebration of Maria's termination, their condescending speeches about professional qualifications, and their confident assertions about business ownership had all been based on assumptions that were not only wrong, but spectacularly backwards. The realization that Maria had been observing their arrogance and enduring their condescension while possessing complete authority to end their involvement at any moment added layers of humiliation that neither cousin was emotionally prepared to process. Their victim had always been their superior, and their demonstration of power had actually been a public display of their own ignorance and presumption. As Rebecca concluded her presentation with documentation showing Maria's authority to make all personnel and operational decisions across the restaurant portfolio, the cousins sat in shell-shocked silence. The woman they had dismissed as an unqualified employee had been revealed as someone whose business expertise, educational credentials, and financial authority exceeded their own in every measurable category. The comfortable fiction that had sustained their confidence for years had been systematically dismantled, leaving them to confront the reality that their understanding of power, authority, and business ownership had been fundamentally and embarrassingly wrong from the very beginning. Wednesday morning brought the kind of reckoning that Derek and Brandon had never imagined possible when they first conceived their hostile takeover plan. Maria arrived at the Bella Vista restaurant at precisely 9 o'clock, accompanied by Rebecca Caldwell and a notary public, carrying documents that would formally and permanently reshape the power structure they had spent a week trying to demolish. The staff gathered with expressions ranging from confusion to anticipation, having witnessed the chaos and conflicting authority claims of the previous week. Many had been working under Maria's leadership for years and had found the cousins' sudden assertions of control both jarring and inexplicable. Maria stood before the assembled group with the quiet dignity of someone who had endured systematic humiliation but emerged with her authority intact and legally confirmed. Her voice carried none of the pleading desperation the cousins had expected, but rather the calm confidence of an executive addressing her employees. "I want to begin by apologizing for the confusion and disruption you have all experienced over the past week," she said clearly. "There have been some serious misunderstandings about the ownership and management structure of our restaurant group that needed to be resolved through proper legal channels." She gestured to Rebecca, who stepped forward with the official documentation that had shattered Derek and Brandon's worldview just 24 hours earlier. "These documents confirm what many of you have suspected, that I am the legal owner of all 8 restaurant properties and have been since 2009. The management agreements that permitted Derek and Brandon to oversee daily operations have been terminated due to their unauthorized actions." Derek and Brandon sat in the back corner of the restaurant, their previous swagger replaced by the hollow expressions of people whose fundamental understanding of reality had been proven catastrophically wrong. The staff members who had watched their condescending behavior toward Maria now understood exactly how inappropriate their actions had been. Maria continued with the measured tone of someone delivering necessary but uncomfortable news. "Effective immediately, Derek and Brandon Rossetti are no longer employed by our restaurant group in any capacity. Their access to all systems, accounts, and operational decisions has been permanently revoked due to gross misconduct and exceeding their authorized responsibilities." She produced a folder containing documentation that Rebecca's investigation had uncovered, evidence of financial irregularities and unauthorized decisions that would have legal consequences extending far beyond simple termination. The vendor contracts that Derek had attempted to renegotiate without authorization, the staff changes he had implemented without approval, and the public statements he had made claiming ownership authority all represented potential liability issues. Rebecca stepped forward to address the legal implications that Derek and Brandon would be facing in the coming weeks. The unauthorized termination letter served to Ms. Torino, the attempted eviction notice, and the public claims of ownership authority constitute several potential legal violations, including harassment, fraud, and interference with business operations. The cousins would be receiving formal notice of civil proceedings seeking damages for their unauthorized actions, including compensation for the disruption caused to vendor relationships, staff morale, and business operations. Their assumption that they could act with impunity had exposed them to financial liability that could extend well into 6-figure territory. Uncle Frank, who had driven in from the suburbs after receiving Maria's phone call, stood up with the expression of someone whose faith in his nephews had been completely shattered. "Maria, I owe you a profound apology for what happened at that family meeting. We all allowed ourselves to be misled by Derek and Brandon's presentations without asking the right questions or demanding to see actual documentation." Other family members who had attended the humiliation meeting began arriving throughout the morning, each offering their own apologies and expressions of support for Maria's leadership. The contrast between their current deference and their previous week's skepticism highlighted how completely Derek and Brandon had manipulated family perceptions through selective information and confident assertions. Aunt Rosalia, despite her advanced age, had insisted on making the trip to personally apologize to Maria. She embraced her great niece with tears in her eyes, expressing shame at how the family had allowed Maria to be publicly humiliated based on false information and malicious misrepresentation. As the morning progressed, Maria revealed the extent of her professional network and business expertise that the cousins had never bothered to investigate. She introduced Elena Rodriguez, a restaurant industry consultant who had been working with Maria for 3 years on expansion strategies and operational optimization initiatives that had driven the consistent revenue growth across all locations. Elena's credentials were impressive in ways that made Derek and Brandon's MBA degrees seem like participation trophies by comparison. She held advanced degrees in hospitality management and food service operations, with 20 years of experience helping restaurant groups achieve sustainable growth and profitability improvements. The strategic initiatives that Derek had claimed credit for were revealed to have been developed through Maria's collaboration with Elena and other industry professionals. The menu optimizations, cost control measures, and customer service improvements had all been based on sophisticated analysis and proven methodologies that required genuine expertise rather than generic business school theories. Maria then introduced Thomas Chun, a certified public accountant who had been managing the financial analysis and tax planning for the restaurant group under Maria's direction. His involvement explained the sophisticated financial reporting and strategic planning documents that had impressed Morrison during the legal proceedings. Thomas presented a comprehensive analysis of the restaurant group's financial performance under Maria's ownership, showing consistent profitability growth and operational efficiency improvements that contradicted every claim Derek and Brandon had made about declining performance and mismanagement. The actual numbers painted a picture of a well-managed business enterprise that was significantly outperforming industry averages. The revelation that Maria had been working with professional consultants and certified accountants while allowing Derek and Brandon to believe they were providing essential expertise added another layer of humiliation to their already devastating situation. They had been playing at business leadership while Maria was operating a sophisticated restaurant empire with genuine professional support. Rebecca then revealed information about Maria's broader business portfolio that extended far beyond the 8 restaurant properties. Her investment portfolio included commercial real estate holdings in 3 states, equity positions in several successful restaurant franchises, and a consulting business that helped other family-owned food service operations improve their profitability and operational efficiency. The scope of Maria's business empire made Derek and Brandon's 5-year involvement in restaurant management seem like a small footnote in a much larger success story. Their assumption that they were rescuing a failing family business from incompetent leadership had been spectacularly wrong from every possible angle. Morrison arrived at noon with settlement documents that outlined the financial consequences Derek and Brandon would face for their unauthorized actions. The civil liability for business disruption, vendor relationship damage, and fraudulent claims of authority could potentially exceed $200,000, depending on how aggressively Maria chose to pursue compensation. Derek and Brandon sat in stunned silence as they processed the magnitude of their miscalculation. Their attempt to seize control of what they assumed was a small family business had exposed them to financial ruin and professional humiliation that would follow them for years to come. Maria addressed them directly for the first time since the legal proceedings had begun, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose position was now unquestionable. Derek and Brandon, you will have 30 days to transition any ongoing projects to staff members I designate. Your final paychecks will be issued according to your original employment agreements, minus any damages that our accounting review determines you cost the business through unauthorized actions. The cousins were also required to issue public corrections to family members and business associates, acknowledging that their claims of ownership authority had been false and that Maria had always been the legal owner and decision-maker for the restaurant group. The humiliation of publicly admitting their error would be almost as devastating as the financial consequences. As the formal proceedings concluded and family members began to disperse, Maria remained behind to begin the process of rebuilding relationships and restoring operational stability. Her grace under pressure and professional handling of the crisis had impressed everyone who witnessed it, establishing her authority in ways that would never again be questioned. The staff members who had remained loyal during the week of chaos were publicly thanked and given assurances about job security and career advancement opportunities. Maria's leadership style, based on competence and respect rather than intimidation and arrogance, stood in stark contrast to the cousins' brief reign of condescension and fear. 6 months later, the restaurant group had not only recovered from the disruption, but had achieved record-breaking performance across all 8 locations. Maria's professional management approach and strategic investments had positioned the business for continued growth and expansion into new markets. Derek and Brandon, meanwhile, had struggled to find employment in the restaurant industry after word of their unauthorized actions spread through professional networks. Their reputation for overreaching their authority and making false claims about business ownership had made them unemployable in positions requiring trust and integrity. The final irony was that Maria's success had made her one of the most respected restaurant owners in the region, with industry associations requesting her participation in leadership committees and speaking engagements. The woman they had dismissed as an unqualified employee had become a recognized expert whose opinion was sought by professionals throughout the food service industry. Family gatherings were markedly different now, with Maria's authority unquestioned and her business acumen celebrated rather than dismissed. The cousins who had once dominated family meetings with their arrogant assertions now sat quietly in the background, their credibility permanently damaged by their spectacular miscalculation. The lesson was clear to everyone who had witnessed the events. Arrogance based on assumptions rather than facts would always be vulnerable to the devastating power of truth, and underestimating someone based on superficial judgments could lead to consequences that lasted far longer than the temporary satisfaction of feeling superior. What did you think of Maria's patient approach to handling Derek and Brandon's arrogance? Have you ever seen someone stay calm and composed when they were being unfairly attacked, only to reveal they had the power all along? Share your thoughts about how satisfying it felt to see the truth finally come out. And tell us if you have ever experienced a similar situation where assumptions about power turn out to be completely wrong.